Hello and welcome everyone. Myself Mijanur Rahaman, and today my topic of discussion is regulation of respiration. And in the previous three videos, we have completed the introduction and nervous mechanism. Now today we will try to discuss about the chemical mechanism. So let us start. Chemical mechanism. Chemical mechanism of regulation of respiration is operated through the chemoreceptors. And the chemoreceptors are the sensory nerve endings which give response to changes in chemical constituents of the blood. Now, changes in chemical constituents of blood which stimulate the chemoreceptors. What are the stimulants? Okay. Then the first one, that is hypoxia, which is decreased partial pressure of oxygen. Then the hypercapnia, the increased pressure of carbon dioxide. Then the increased hydrogen ion concentration. So these are the stimulant for changes in chemical constituents of blood which stimulates for the chemoreceptors. Now, types of chemoreceptor. The chemoreceptor are classified into two groups. One is central chemoreceptor and one is peripheral chemoreceptor. First of all, the central chemoreceptor. The central chemoreceptors are the chemoreceptors present in the brain. So, where the central chemoreceptor present? Present in the brain. Now, situation. Central chemoreceptors are situated in deeper part of the medulla oblongata. And close to the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, and this area is also known as chemosensitive area. And the neurons are called the chemoreceptors, and chemoreceptors are in close contact with blood and cerebrospinal fluid. Now, mechanism of action. Central chemoreceptors are connected with respiratory centers, particularly the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, through the synapses. And these chemoreceptors act slowly but effectively. And central chemoreceptors are responsible for 70 to 80% increased ventilation through chemical regulatory mechanism. Okay, so this is the major group. So what happens? The mechanism is central chemoreceptors are connected with respiratory centers, particularly with the dorsal respiratory group of neurons through the synapses, and the chemoreceptors act slowly but effectively. And the central chemoreceptors are responsible for nearly about 70 to 80% of the increased ventilation through chemical regulatory mechanism. And main stimulant for central chemoreceptors is the increased hydrogen ion concentration. So main stimulant for central chemoreceptor is the increased hydrogen concentration. Okay. However, if hydrogen ion concentration increases in the blood, it cannot stimulate the central chemoreceptors because the hydrogen ions from the blood cannot cross the blood-brain barrier and blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. And on the other hand, if carbon dioxide in the blood, it can easily cross the blood-brain barrier and blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier and enter into the interstitial fluid of the brain or the CSF, and there the carbon dioxide combines with the water to form the carbonic acid. And since the carbonic acid is unstable, it immediately dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. And the mechanism is CO2 plus H2O, which forms H2CO3, which is an unstable component which will convert into the HCO3 minus. Okay, so what happens here? The carbonic acid which is formed H2CO3, which is unstable, and further which dissociate and from H plus and the bicarbonate ion. And the hydrogen ions stimulate the central chemoreceptors. From the chemoreceptors, the excitatory impulses are sent to the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, which results in the increased ventilation and increased rate and force of breathing. And because of this, the excess carbon dioxide is washed out and the respiration is brought back to normal. And lack of oxygen does not have the significant effect on the central chemoreceptors, except that it generally depresses the overall function of the brain. So what happens here? The chemical regulation of the CSF, that is, first of all, the decreased ventilation, which will conduct three parts: decrease in partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, and increase in hydrogen ion in the blood. Now, the decreased partial pressure of oxygen will stimulate the peripheral chemoreceptor, and increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood stimulate the diffusion of carbon dioxide into CSF, and it also a mild effect in stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptors. And the diffusion of carbon dioxide into the CSF form H plus ion, and which will stimulate the central chemoreceptor, and it will give stimulation to dorsal group of neuron. And the dorsal group of neuron if affect on the efferent impulses to respiratory muscle, and which will increase the ventilation. And the increased H plus in the world also a mild effect in stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptor, and peripheral chemoreceptor we'll discuss in the part, then we will come in the diagram. Okay. Now, peripheral chemoreceptors are the chemoreceptors present in the carotid and aortic region. Now, mechanism of action. Hypoxia is the most potent stimulant for peripheral chemoreceptors, and it is because of the presence of oxygen sensitive potassium channels in the glomus cells of peripheral chemoreceptors. And hypoxia causes closure of oxygen sensitive potassium channels and prevents the potassium efflux. This leads to depolarization of glomus cell, and which is a receptor potential and generation of action potential in the nerve ending. And these impulses passes through the aortic and Hering nerves through and excite the dorsal group of neurons. And the dorsal group of neurons in turn send excitatory impulses to the respiratory muscle, and which results in the increased ventilation. And this provides enough oxygen and rectifies the lack of oxygen. And in addition to hypoxia, the peripheral chemoreceptors are also stimulated by hypercapnia and increased hydrogen ion concentration. However, the sensitivity of peripheral chemoreceptor to hypercapnia and increased hydrogen ion concentration is mild. So this is the role of peripheral the chemoreceptors. And now stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptor will act upon the afferent impulse via the Hering nerve and aortic nerve. And the Hering nerve and aortic nerve will stimulate the dorsal group of neurons, then efferent impulses to respiratory muscle, then increase ventilation. If we summarize today's topic, then first of all we have discussed about the chemical mechanism. So what is chemical mechanism? It is the regulation of respiration operated through chemoreceptors. And chemoreceptors are sensory nerve endings which give response to changes in the chemical constituents of the blood. Now, changes in the chemical constituents of the blood which stimulate the chemoreceptors are the hypoxia, hypercapnia, and increased hydrogen ion concentration. Hypoxia is decreased partial pressure of oxygen. Hypercapnia is the increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and increased hydrogen ion concentration. Now, types of chemoreceptor. It is of two types: one is central and one is peripheral. First of all, the central. Central chemoreceptor are present in the brain. It is present in the deeper part of the medulla oblongata, which is close to the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, and this area is known as chemosensitive area. And the neurons are called chemoreceptors, and the chemoreceptors are in close contact with the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. And the mechanism of action is the central chemoreceptor are connected with the respiratory centers, and particularly the dorsal respiratory group of neurons through the synapses. And these chemoreceptors act slowly but effectively. Now, central chemoreceptors are responsible for nearly about 70 to 80% of the increased ventilation through chemical regulatory mechanism, and the main stimulant for the central chemoreceptor is the increased hydrogen ion concentration. However, if hydrogen ion concentration increases in the blood, it cannot stimulate the central chemoreceptor because the hydrogen ion from the blood cannot cross the blood-brain barrier and blood-cerebrospinal fluid barrier. And on the other hand, if carbon dioxide increases in the blood, it can easily cross the blood-brain barrier and the blood-cerebrospinal fluid barrier and enter the interstitial fluid of the brain or the cerebrospinal fluid or CSF. And there the carbon dioxide combines with the water to form the carbonic acid, and since carbonic acid is unstable, it immediately dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. That is CO2 plus H2 that which form the carbonic acid H2CO3 and which dissociate into H plus and the bicarbonate ion that is HCO3 minus. And hydrogen ions stimulate the central chemoreceptor. From chemoreceptor, the excitatory impulses are sent to the dorsal group of neurons and resulting in increased ventilation, which is increased rate and modes of breathing. And because of this, the excess carbon dioxide is washed out and the respiration is brought back to normal. And lack of oxygen does not have any significant effect on the central chemoreceptor, except that it generally depresses the overall function of the brain. Now, peripheral chemoreceptor, that are the chemoreceptor present in the carotid and aortic region. And mechanism of action is the hypoxia is the most potent stimulant for peripheral chemoreceptor. In case of central, the main stimulant is increased hydrogen ion concentration, and in case of peripheral, the hypoxia is the most potent stimulant for the peripheral chemoreceptor, and it is because of the presence of the oxygen sensitive potassium channels in the glomus cells of the peripheral chemoreceptors. Now, hypoxia causes closure of oxygen sensitive potassium channels and prevent potassium efflux. This leads to depolarization of glomus cells, that is receptor potential, and generation of action potential in the nerve ending. Now, these impulses pass through the aortic and Hering nerves and excite the dorsal group of neurons. Now, dorsal group of neurons in turn they send excitatory impulses to respiratory muscles, and which results in increased ventilation. Now, this provides enough oxygen and rectifies the lack of the oxygen. And in addition to hypoxia, the peripheral chemoreceptors are also stimulated by hypercapnia and increased hydrogen ion concentration also. And however, the sensitivity of peripheral chemoreceptor to hypercapnia and increased hydrogen concentration is very mild. So if you see the diagram, the figure that is decreased ventilation, it is found in three cases or three stimulant, that is decreased in the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, then increased hydrogen ion concentration in the blood, and increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. That is, first of all, in the first point we have discussed about the hypoxia, then increased hydrogen ion concentration in blood, then the hypercapnia. Then the increased blood pressure, increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, which will diffuse to carbon dioxide into CSF, which will form H plus ion, which stimulate the central chemoreceptor and which stimulate the dorsal group of neurons. Then increased hydrogen ion concentration, which is mild effect on the stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptor, and decrease in partial pressure of oxygen in the blood stimulate the peripheral chemoreceptor, and hypercapnia also have a mild effect. These stimulant will stimulate the afferent impulses via the hearing nerve and the aortic nerve, which will stimulate the dorsal group of neurons, and the dorsal group of neurons will effect upon the efferent impulses to respiratory muscle, and which will increase the increased ventilation. So this is our today's topic. Thank you so much for watching the entire video.